before I begin, it's customary to...
Oh, sorry, could you stand?
Oh, even better.
Yes.
Professor Adi, everyone.
Before I start, as I say, we have to pay our respects to the elders, and I'm going to name one particular elder tonight who is a very famous Pan-Africanist. He's no longer with us, but his granddaughter is here with us. So Dorothy, if you'd like to stand just for a moment. Dorothy is the granddaughter of Chris Jones, who of course you've all heard of, sometimes known as Chris Braithwaite. You can sit down now and take a round of applause. For those people who don't know anything about history, Chris Braithwaite was one of the key Pan-Africanists in this country in the 1920s and 1930s, involved with all kinds of organizations, an organizer of workers, particularly seafarers, mariners. He was very much involved in the struggle against Italian fascism for the defense of Ethiopia in 1935. Anyway, if you don't know who Chris Jones was, you can Google him when you get home and find out something useful about Pan-Africanism. Okay, so the second thing I want to say is that I understand the motion is something about that black people must accept something. And I would say that historically speaking, I don't know about black people, but Africans have never accepted anything. And there's no reason why Africans today should accept anything. We are the agents of our own lives and our own liberators, and so even the notion of accepting anything to me is, anyway, words fail me to be honest, but anyway, those who are speaking for emotion can talk about that. So then we come on to the question of Pan-Africanism and really what it is or what it could be, and people have different views as to what Pan-Africanism might be, when it started, why it existed, and so on and so forth. So let me just for a couple of minutes again return to history a little bit. We could go back to various times and places in Africa, but as we're in London, I'm going to start in London. And I think probably the first major Pan-Africanism in London, Pan-African organisation in London, probably dates from around the 1780s, something like that. And there was an organisation formed in London called the Sons of Africa, some of you may have heard of, which was an organisation led by a man called Olaudah Equiano, and in fact two men, Olaudah Equiano and Ottobah Cugoano, who were both Africans who had been kidnapped and enslaved, and then by various means liberated themselves and came and lived in this country and were activists at that time. The major problem that Africans faced at that time in this country was the problem of enslavement and loss of liberty, and they fought alongside others to deal with that particular problem. And they organized alongside other Africans, irrespective of their nation or region of origin. They organized together to deal with a common problem. And they recognized that they had a common destiny. That is to say, their interests, their fates were bound together. And that if they organized together, it was more likely that they were going to change the situation which faced them and millions of other Africans. So that organization, that activity is a very good illustration of Pan-Africanism at that time in the 18th century, of Africans organizing together to liberate themselves and deal with the particular problems they face. Of course, in the years that followed, Pan-Africanism and Pan-African organizations took different forms, but the essence of the need for Pan-Africanism was the fact that Africans were oppressed in various ways, whether through enslavement, colonialism, imperialism, facing up and dealing with the problems of racism and so on. And were also obviously dispersed. There was if you like, a separation between those who lived on the continent and those who were forcibly transported into another world, the diaspora as we call it. So those problems, as I say, have lasted for many years, and people have looked to different solutions to deal with them. In the period when Chris Jones was active, for example, there were a different set of problems. The problems of enslavement of the 18th century didn't exist in the same way. The main problems were those of colonialism, colonial rule, particularly in Africa, but also in the Caribbean, as well as related problems of racism and so on in the US, in Britain, other places. And so there was a need then for Africans to come together, to organize themselves to overcome these specific problems. And they did that, and in many ways were successful. In a later period, as we know, the problem was more how to achieve the liberation of Africa, particularly the liberation from colonial rule, or from the legacies of colonial rule, from apartheid and so on and so forth. And so again, it was necessary for Africans to organize themselves, not just in the continent, but around the world in the diaspora, to come together to achieve various aims and so on. And we could say, generally speaking, that those were also successful to some degree. So when we look at what are problems facing Africans and people of African descent today, well, we can discuss what those problems are, in what sense they remain, whether racism is still a problem. So some people might think that racism has gone away, it's no longer a problem. I don't know whether any of those people are here. Yes. Maybe some people who believe that. Of course, people can believe what they like, but as they say, facts are stubborn things. So we know from our own experience, irrespective of what we believe, that these problems still exist. And in fact, it's interesting that one, you can say, Pan-African manifestation of the struggle against racism, I suppose, is something like Black Lives Matter, which is not just a kind of US phenomenon, but it exists in Britain and other parts of the world and so on. So, the point being, whatever these problems are, whether it's the question of racism, whether it's the question of the continual division of Africa, the chair mentioned some of these problems. The intervention of foreign powers in Africa, not least the intervention of the British government and the big multinationals in Britain and so on. There are all these problems that we can go into in greater detail in the Q&A and so on. So the question is, what is the solution to those problems? Do we say, well, it doesn't really matter, we just carry on, we go to work 9 till 5, we don't do anything about it? Or do we say we should do something about all these things which affect us? If we think we should do something, should we do it on our own, or should we get together and unite to deal with what are common problems? Because if they're common problems, then it makes sense for people to get together to deal with them. And we may find there's similar problems in other places, and that we can learn from others, we can talk to others, we can organize with others. Some of us may have even family connections in different parts of the world, in the Caribbean or Africa. We're in contact with all kinds of people. So the idea that we just go on in our lives not being concerned with what other people are doing, that we try and solve our problems on our own, to me, doesn't make any sense. And people have never done that in history. Never successfully solved any problem by not organizing with others who have a similar problem, and therefore a similar concern and a similar destiny and so on. So that's really what Pan-Africanism is about. And of course, there are different views of what kind of Pan-Africanism one should have. And of course, we can go into that and discuss that. And that's always been the case in history. I was reading actually something again from the 1930s today, another very famous Pan-Africanist, George Padmore, was writing to somebody, and he said, well, of course, there are all kinds of people have all kinds of different views. Some black people who are here, they're communists, some are more conservative, some vote this way, some vote that way, some come from the Caribbean, some come from... It doesn't matter, he said. What we found is that if we come together, then because we have common problems, then that's a much more effective way of addressing these problems. So that's really the essence of Pan-Africanism. In other words, as long as these problems facing Africans globally exist, there will be some need for Africans globally to come together, to unite, to try and deal with problems. Then, as I said, the question is, what way should they be dealt with? And also, even more importantly, what are our demands? Some people are a bit timid, don't like making demands, and so on. But, of course, historically, Africans have always made demands to deal with the problems that face us in any particular place. So in the 21st century in Britain, what are our demands? What is it we need to solve those problems that face us as Africans? So I don't want to go into it all now, because that would be going into everything.
1 minute left.
Just a little bit too much, but fine. Okay. So one problem that we face as Africans is that we are, just take this country for example, we are disempowered. We are not the decision makers. So I, as a citizen of this country, I want to be a decision maker. I want to decide what goes on in this country. I want to decide what kind of health service I have, or what kind of education my grandkids now have, or whatever. All of these things I want to make decisions about. I want to be a decision maker so that I know that the government of this country is not intervening in Africa or the Caribbean or wherever it's creating problems. It's not invading other countries and so on. So you may have other things. I just mentioned a few things. One can go on. What about the question of what is taught? Are we taught in our mother tongues, for example, at school? Why not? Why is English prioritised over every other language? So there are all these questions. What is taught in terms of language? What history is taught? How? Anyway, we could go. So these are things that need to be solved for Africans to exist in this country as not second-class citizens or first-class citizens, but first-class citizens.
Yeah.